tomorrow at the consequences. If you think back to yesterday's lecture was quite strong on illustrations, on images and photographs. And I have indeed quite a number of them today as well. But today there will be an added dimension, and that is the dimension of personal testimony. Drawing on interviews which I did nearly 40 years ago with survivors of the flu. And that's, of course, what makes up the contents of this book, which we launched tomorrow at lunchtime. So if yesterday was strong on images, today will be strong on images and the words of contemporaries who lived through the epidemic. This is the direction that I'm going to be taking in this morning's lecture. Firstly, obviously looking at the arrival of the epidemic in South Africa, its transmission to South Africa, and then its spread within South Africa. Then I'll be looking at that very characteristic human response to disaster, blaming. It's them, accusations, finger-pointing. South Africa is almost a world leader in blaming. And then I'll be looking at coping, the various ways in which the community sought to cope with this devastating epidemic. Let me start by giving you, in a sense, in quite stark terms, the parameters of the epidemic in South Africa. 300,000 deaths. That's about 6% of the population dead in 6 weeks. Tens of thousands of wives and husbands turned into widows or widowers virtually overnight. Hundreds of thousands of orphans created almost at a stroke. Those are the bare bones of the statistics of this huge, horrific impact on South Africa in terms of mortality, but also, as I was suggesting in yesterday's lecture, there are a lot of consequences beyond just mortality in terms of the social consequences, orphans, widows, widowers. This epidemic in South Africa raged between September and November 1918. It was known, as I think I mentioned, as Black October by contemporaries. This became the synonym in South Africa for the Spanish flu, Black October. It was quite simply the worst epidemic ever to hit South Africa. In terms of intensity, in terms of scope and range, and in terms of its lethal impact. Never before and never since has the subcontinent experienced such a massive, intensive epidemic. You will know that it was, of course, not limited to South Africa. It's part of this worldwide pandemic, which started back in March 1918, that first wave, first apparent, though not necessarily first present, in Kansas, spread through the military camps in the US, across the North Atlantic to Western Europe, and then from Western Europe, that first wave spread quite widely across the world. And that first wave was one which was very infectious, but which was not all that deadly, not all that lethal. It was the second wave, the one which emerged in August 1918 and spread, which was the big killer. So, trying to track the path by which the epidemic reached South Africa, it seems to have reached South Africa from two directions. And indeed, the consequences of that are very significant, as I will spell out in this lecture. It seems to have been right at the beginning of September that the almost tail end of that first wave, the infectious but not all that deadly wave, reached Durban from troops coming back, South African troops coming back from the Middle East. So it rather appears that almost at the very end of the first wave circling the globe, it reached the southeastern part of South Africa via Durban. And there are reports of an outbreak in Durban, but very characteristically first wave. Infectious, but not particularly deadly. And then we can track it. It more or less then goes up the railway line to the Witwatersrand. In September 1918, it begins to cause some disruption on the gold mines of the Witwatersrand, laying off a significant number of miners, but not killing. Here's a contemporary comment from the Reuters correspondent in Johannesburg. It will produce, quote, temporary inconvenience, but without serious loss. In view of the fact that such a very large number of people have been affected, the fact that there has been only one death must be considered to be reassuring. Well, it's almost like a Greek tragedy, because clearly this is evidence of the first wave, having entered through Durban, gone up the railway line, perhaps soldiers, perhaps migrant workers, and hit Johannesburg, causing a large number of people to be laid low, but not a large number of deaths. And the feeling was, well, we can easily cope with this short-term disruption. However, almost as this optimistic, almost breezy Reuters report was appearing, South Africa was being infected from a different direction and with second wave influenza, infectious and deadly. In the middle of September 1918, 2 troop ships arrived in Cape Town, having called at Freetown. And you may remember from yesterday's lecture, Freetown was one of the 3 major wartime ports where the second wave exploded, the other 2 being Boston and Brest. And having called at Freetown, the troops returning to South Africa, they were from what was then called the South African Native Labour Corps, which were effectively African soldiers, not allowed to bear arms, but to provide labour. They reached Cape Town towards the end of September 1918, bringing, we can see with retrospect, second wave influenza with them. However, health authorities in Cape Town thought, well, it's probably just this wide-spreading but not particularly lethal epidemic. And after 2 days quarantine, and where did they quarantine them? Let's just get my directions right. Rosebank Showgrounds, just over on the other side there. They quarantined them for 2 days. After 2 days, no one showed particular symptoms of anything particularly serious. They allowed them to be demobilized, and they sent them on troop trains around the country. Within days, we can see the consequences of that. If we really go to a very remote part of the country, Tsolo in Transkei. Here's the magistrate of Tsolo writing early in October 1918. Sickness has become rife amongst both races in the village and the country. People are being brought into the local doctor by wagons and sledge loads. And so that is one of countless examples of the flu having spread along the railway lines, particularly carried by these demobilized soldiers. And so, as I was saying yesterday, an epidemic spread by steam engine, the steam engine on the ship and the steam engine on the railway. This was the driving force which brought the second wave, the lethal, deadly second wave, to South Africa. By the middle of October, almost the entire country had been overwhelmed by this same plight as demobilized soldiers and migrant workers began to flee home to get away from the infected cities. And here is the first of my contemporary witnesses. Years ago, I sat in Galeshewe Township outside Kimberley, and I spoke to an 88-year-old former migrant worker who had been working at De Beers mine in Kimberley. And this is what he told me. My contract at De Beers Consolidated Mine ended on the 30th of September, 1918. On October the 2nd, I was due to be discharged, so I went to number 4 compound where there were many men waiting for discharge. While I was there, streams of men began to come in to be hospitalized in the makeshift hospital which had been opened at number 4 compound, as the main mine hospital was already full. By 10 a.m., the makeshift hospital was overcrowded too, with people sleeping on the floor, only on blankets. Those who could not get into this hospital sat outside groaning. Those to be discharged were first searched for illegal diamonds before being examined by 4 doctors, 2 of whom were soon sent back to the hospital. Of the 2 doctors who remained, 1 took ill and 1 died. His body was taken away on a stretcher. He was replaced by another doctor. Miners who were not too sick were discharged. After I was examined, I passed one of the doctors. I took a tram with others to Beaconsfield, one of the suburbs of Kimberley. Those who were too sick to walk into the tram hired a horse cart to take them to the tram in Beaconsfield. When they disembarked there was not a single person about the whole of the market square in Beaconsfield. It was unusually quiet. Then I went to the station with 3 friends to take a train home. And this is an account by the migrant worker going home, and one which can be replicated many, many, many times as we can track the flu spreading. I caught the 8 p.m. train to Mafeking. On the journey, passengers were taken ill and some died. I got off with one of my friends at Kempdorp, which is a junction north of Kimberley, and I began to walk home. As we walked, I began to shiver, and soon I and my friend could only crawl, unable to carry our luggage. I struggled on in this way, on my knees for the whole day. I reached my home at Driefontein, which is probably about 25 kilometers west of Jan Kempdorp. I reached my home at Driefontein on the 3rd of October and fell into a deep sleep. I only regained full consciousness on the 19th of October. During those 16 days, I was delirious, imagining that I saw my friends when in fact they'd already died. I believe, and there was a sob in his voice when he said this to me, I believe that I brought the epidemic to Driefontein. Many people there subsequently died of the flu, and many houses were closed up for good. I recall that the flu began in my loins, followed by symptoms of vomiting blood, dizziness, screaming and wanting to run away, delirium. By December, I was feeling much better, but the soles of my feet turned green and my skin peeled off. So there's a dramatic account of someone who effectively was a vector, a carrier of the epidemic, one of thousands of young men, particularly young men, on the move. In the cities, in Cape Town, deaths, as I think Ed already mentioned on Monday, deaths topped 400 per day. That's 40 times greater than the normal figure. Here's a contemporary cartoon by Bunzaya, the cartoonist of Die Burger. In fact, the first one I showed you was of the same, capturing the full horror of death stalking the slums of Cape Town. It's called the Nemesis of Neglect. In fact, it's an allusion to a Punch cartoon in the 1880s at the time of Jack the Ripper, a very famous cartoon. But the neglect here is of decay and poor sanitation and overcrowding, really to give you a sense of that full horror. Just let me go back and show that. That's also the Bunzaya cartoon of the Spanish flu stalking the Cape Town. In Kimberley, at the height of the epidemic, and for reasons I'll talk about presently, Kimberley was probably the worst hit city in South Africa. At the height of the epidemic, it was estimated that if the deaths continued at that same rate, within 16 months, the entire population of Kimberley would have been wiped out. It was that speed at which it was escalating and the huge number of deaths which made Kimberley really a death trap, both for those in the city and especially for those in the mines, like the man that had escaped from the mine just ahead of that outbreak. In Bloemfontein, to take another example, shops, offices and workshops were closed for want of staff. Public transport and services like the post office were paralyzed. Ailing residents dropped dead in the streets. in the words of a Bloemfontein newspaper, all this week the hand of disease has lain heavily on the town, and so uncanny was the stillness in the streets and shops that we might have been in a city of the dead. And here's my second personal testimony from Bloemfontein. This is from the wife of a man who was pressed into service as a gravedigger in Kimberley, from Mabel Bakoku, who was 88 at the time when I interviewed her in 1981. My husband was employed normally at Champions. Champions was a big general dealer shop in Bloemfontein. But he got special permission to work at the cemetery as a gravedigger. He literally, here's a nice paradoxical phrase, he literally lived at the cemetery. I was very afraid for him, for some of the grave diggers just fell into the pits they were digging, and when he came home, I would cry that he must stop going there as he would be infected. I worried terribly, as I was a young mother with 2 children and a third due soon, but he carried on going to the cemetery to help, and he did not contract flu. He was as strong as a mule. At the cemetery, there was no time for systematic graves to be dug. Trenches were dug. People were buried in Hessian sacks, and these were dumped one on top of another. There was no time for funeral services to be held. People were dying like flies. I did not get the flu, but many expectant mothers and newlyweds died. Brides collapsed at the altar. It was a sad time. My mother-in-law died, but I was pregnant, and I did not go to the funeral, as the custom was that pregnant women did not attend a funeral. As eerie, as haunting was the silence in the countryside, in rural areas. Here's an account from a missionary in the Eastern Cape. For 2 weeks, a great solemn hush has prevailed. No one is to be seen, no one to be heard, no life on the farms, no work on the lands. Lord Influenza and his followers have held the countryside in their grip. Corpses lay alongside the sick in kraals. Animals wandered in the fields unherded, and cows went unmilked. The epidemic, in the words of one contemporary, you can get the sense of this huge cloud hanging over him as he surveyed the mayhem. The epidemic threatens the existence of the entire race. Well, that gives you a sense of this horror of the flu engulfing South Africa in double speed time. I want now to talk about blaming, one of those characteristic human. It's not peculiar to South Africa, but South Africa seems to have developed it into a fine art of blaming people in the midst of a disaster. As in most epidemics, blame was clearly expressed and articulated alongst many of the existing fault lines and prejudices within the country. So, some whites blamed Africans for recklessly spreading the disease as they fled from from epidemic hotspots. There were even calls made for Africans to be barred from the trains to prevent the spread of disease. Correspondingly, some Africans blamed whites, and particularly their government. They believed that the government wanted to kill them. For instance, a team of white relief workers in the Ciskei reported that they were preceded by a local, quote, telling the people that this disease was a device of the Europeans to finish off the native races of South Africa. And as it had not been quite successful, they were sending out men with poison, the syringes with a vaccine, to complete the work of extermination. For many rural Africans, therefore, hospitals and whites offering medicine or anti-flu vaccine were to be shunned at all costs. An Anglican bishop who went on a relief trip in the Transkei recorded in his diary, "The people simply would not have us. One stood outside his hut and insisted that his child was better. Another woman took our medicine but said we had come to poison them." Another series of blaming, not unexpected given that this is still World War I, as indeed one elderly woman told me, "Oh, it's very obvious, germs, Germans." lots of finger pointing at the Kaiser and Germans. This was all part of, I suppose, biological warfare by the Germans. So lots and lots of finger pointing, lots of letters in the press alleging, as Bloemfontein newspaper said, the Kaiser's alleged share in or authorship of this calamity. While one doctor insisted that Spanish flu is not an appropriate name. German plague is much more accurate. Moreover, local white politicians didn't miss the opportunity to point fingers at other politicians. The leader of the then National Party, General Herzog, believed that the government of General Botha quite deliberately had let loose the flu, he said, to wipe out his political opponents. Others expressed a view that the flu was a divine warning that we shouldn't interfere in wars conducted outside of our borders. So, not unusually, but very markedly in South Africa, the arrival of the flu opened up all sorts of finger-pointing and blame, which really are evidence of deeper prejudices, deeper sense of the other, which were rife in South Africa then, and perhaps still. I now want to talk about how did South African society cope with this, I think I used the word the other day, this tsunami overwhelming them, the tsunami of the Spanish flu. Well, most obvious was this vision of bodies piling up. You've heard from the gravedigger's wife, you've heard from other sources of a rising tide of corpses. Residents of the country's towns and cities were very hard-pressed to cope with this. In Cape Town, municipal carts toured the streets, picking up bodies of people who had died literally while walking. Here is a third. Here is the third account of someone who witnessed exactly this scene in Somerset Road, just at the beginning of Greenpoint in Cape Town. Many of these wagons were known then as Scotch carts. And the Scotch cart is a word which I've heard time and time again. Scotch carts piled high with bodies with a tarpaulin over them. Here's his account. He was an 8-year-old boy when the flu struck. I would run up to the corner of Alfred Street and Somerset Road, where I witnessed something which is very vivid in my mind still. The people all along the road were, to all appearances, I would have taken it, that they were drunk. They were just dropping like ninepins. It must have been just a coincidence that I was there at the time when there was a Scotch cart, or as they called it, a Scotch cart or a dray cart, with two men. They were leading the cart and horse, not driving it from the seat, and it would be bodies. And in it would be bodies. And they would say, here's another one. And they would pick it up and 1, 2, and heave it onto the Scotch cart. At the same time, they would stop for a drink, for brandy, for Picardy brandy. I remember that very well. My father used to get it. And they would have a swig, and suddenly one says, oh, there's someone over there. And I think I might have shouted, Mister, that man's calling for help. And I could see an arm in this pile of bodies trying to get itself out and pull itself out. And they put the corpse up against the wall and put a tag on him or something. I know they did something to his front, and that's all I remember because I was wrenched from the back. I forget who it was, and I got a terrible beating for being out on the streets from my father. That's the kind of image which deeply impressed itself on everyone that I spoke to, of bodies piling up, of streets, Adley Street, as well as many others, strewn with bodies of people who had just collapsed in the street. The office of the cemetery board was besieged by crowds wanting to arrange burials. The morgue attendants, undertakers, and clergymen were swept off their feet by this immense set of demands placed on them. The Anglican Church actually put one of their ministers on permanent duty at Maitland Cemetery. There were so many funerals to take place. And the mayor's chaplain, the chaplain formerly allocated to serve the mayor, the mayor's chaplain was sent to Maitland every day to officiate at any funerals where there was no minister available. If that was Cape Town, as I've already hinted, Kimberley was infinitely worse. This is a page from the cemetery register of one of Kimberley's cemeteries. It is just one page, 2 days, 13th of October and 14th of October, and the 14th continues over here. What you might be able to pick up, which is really confirmation of something which we've been saying all through this course, is the ages of those who died of influenza. And you can see the ages are overwhelmingly young adults. Very clear evidence of that characteristic feature of the Spanish flu, that young adults were far and away the most vulnerable. In Kimberley, the number of funerals was such that they continued into the night by headlamps of cars which were switched on so that the funerals could continue. Coffins in Kimberley, and indeed in Cape Town, were in short supply. Bodies, consequently, were wrapped only in a blanket. Many of these corpses were placed in mass graves, a measure which the giant De Beers Mining Company, and De Beers really was, in 1918, the heart of Kimberley. De Beers was what drove Kimberley. De Beers miners died in their thousands, and De Beers stopped funerals outside of its territory and dug a huge hole and buried miners one upon another on its own territory. In one of the cemeteries, the municipal cemeteries in Kimberley, an officiating clergyman recalled African flu victims were buried in a fresh mass grave every day between 2 and 4 p.m., irrespective of their religion. Here's an extract from his reminiscences. 25 bodies were placed in this massed grave, each in a blanket. Then we sang, I said prayers, and then a thin layer of soil was thrown over them. Then came the next 25 bodies. Usually 100 bodies were buried in this way every day, but sometimes it was 125 and once 150. That required 6 consecutive services. Doctors, as I already mentioned yesterday, were at an utter loss to know how to treat this disease. The medicines they recommended ranged from aspirin, quinine, Epsom salts, hastily concocted special flu mixtures. All were equally useless. Here is, again, a personal testimony from an apprentice pharmacist in Kimberley at the time. I was 18 years old at the time and was serving my apprenticeship to a chemist and druggist, W.N. Cooper. Towards the end of September 1918, we received on 2 or 3 occasions prescriptions from Dr. Ash. Dr. Ash was one of the most eminent general practitioners in Kimberley at the time. My master, the pharmacist, expressed surprise that Dr. Ash's different prescriptions for the same patient, who was about 17 or 18. He was prescribing for symptoms which appeared to baffle him. The boy died within 2 or 3 days, and it was only then that we were told that we were in the throes of this frightful epidemic of Spanish influenza. Doctors were without the means to know what to do in the face of this, other than recommend palliative care nursing. poignantly, and again, that's a word which I've used in this set of lectures. I spoke to the son of a Cape Town doctor at the time. The boy was 14, and his father took him on many of his rounds with him. And he recalled to me, again with a sob in his voice, that a newly married couple lived across the road from their home. And his father had been called on to treat this newly married couple, and both of them died within days of each other. And then he said, that was the first time I ever saw my father cry. He was sobbing in sorrow and frustration at his impotence. In the absence of Western medicine, of biomedicine's ability to do anything effective, that opened up the path for quacks and for opportunists, for claims to be made for all sorts of antidotes. Here's one of them. Don't miss a trick, or the makers of Collison's brandy did not miss a trick. There are scores of adverts of the same sort in the press of the time. One which caught my attention was for something called Sibylline antiseptic skin ointment, which you applied to the inside of your nostrils and was a guarantee to keep infection out. And then this morning, courtesy of L and Ethylene Lastovica, I had brought into me a bottle of Jay's fluid, which was widely used at the time. This is a bottle from the time, and this indeed is a bottle which may well have held something which the person swigging it down believed would prevent the flu. So if you are courageous and brave enough, you might want to have a touch of that Jay's fluid bottle. The name is inscribed on the side. Others said, it's largely a matter of panic. People are being cowardly. We need to have a positive outlook. We must think positively. And these young soldiers at Potchefstroom military camp stood in front of the camera, beaming with their little dog, the pet dog, and then across the top of the photograph wrote, "Killing the flu by being cheerful." In the end, the absence of any sure cure for most South Africans meant that they probably put their faith in folk remedies, in patent medicines, and time-honoured practices and nostrums, like fleeing. Fair number of cases of towns losing the population as people fled into the hills to try and escape infection. Quite a number of cases of farmers barring the entry to their farms to keep people away and thereby keep infection away. Many Africans turned to traditional herbalists, to sangomas, and also to witch finders, isanusi, to check the disease. As a result, those whom the witch finders said were responsible for this extraordinarily large number of deaths, this unnaturally large number of deaths, were pointed out and either punished or in some cases killed. The increase in attacks as a result of those who were identified as witches prompted in 1919 the South African government to tighten up the Transkei Penal Code to lay down stiffer penalties for so-called witch finding. Any number of cases appeared in the courts of families who had been held to be responsible for employing a witch finder and identifying someone who had then been attacked or in some cases actually killed. The South African state, of course, largely resorted to Western biomedicine. So such medical assistance as it did provide was exclusively of that nature. The South African Health Department barely existed. It was 3 men in an office in Pretoria. That was the whole of the South African, it wasn't even a full department. There wasn't even a Minister of Health. It was a sub-department. And the best that these 3 men could do was to take the latest advice arriving from Britain and send out pamphlets and leaflets on how to treat the epidemic, on trying to get doctors and nurses to send them to the most stricken areas. And also belatedly to commission the Institute of Medical Research in Johannesburg to prepare, to concoct would be a better word, some anti-flu vaccine. And if you have a look at the contents of that vaccine, they put in everything they could think of together with the kitchen sink. It really was more of psychological attempt than anything realistic. Given the sub-department of health poor organization, limited capacity of staffing, most of the initiative was taken by the municipalities around their country, with the assistance of public-spirited volunteers eager to do their bit during the war, to show that they were willing to volunteer as soldiers had volunteered. They set up temporary hospitals and opened relief depots to supply food, soup, medicine. Here's some very rare images. That's the Johannesburg Temporary Influenza Hospital in Twist Street. A nurse in that hospital giving a flu patient something to drink. An outside emergency hospital outside Newcastle in what is now KwaZulu-Natal in Natal, with clearly patients here and some doctors and nursing assistants. And then some relief images of relief depots, also very, very unusual. Anyone, this is Cape Town, anyone identify where that is? City Hall, exactly. That's the side of the City Hall. I think Woolworths is on this side of that Long Market Street. Yeah, I think that's Long Market Street. Queues of people circling the City Hall, waiting for soup or medicine or food or something along those lines. Very characteristic of Cape Town. And in Johannesburg, you can see there's the whole list of medicine, of food and medicine depots. And again, some very rare photographs of these food and medicine depots in action. Boy Scouts giving some, I think it's probably soup, to residents of Johannesburg. And there is the Governor General, Viscount Buxton, with a whole array of boys and girls, and here's the soup in these great big canisters. He's about to present them with something from these canisters. And there's the Mayoress of Johannesburg giving soup to a range of Johannesburg residents. The Union Defence Force also lent a hand. Once the flu had waned and soldiers not so many soldiers were down, doctors and nurses, who of course were in uniform because it's World War I, were sent to a number of sites by the Defence Force. The Defence Force even sent field ambulances to provide assistance to civilians in the Transkei and in the Transvaal, and in several places military hospitals were opened to non-military patients. In Kimberley, again, that worst hit cities in South Africa, the military director of medical services, Colonel Orenstein, was actually given carte blanche to take over the running of the city. So desperate were the municipal authorities to try and to check the epidemic, that when it became known that he was willing to come down from Johannesburg and take over, they sent him a telegram, and it tells you just about everything to read the words of the telegram. Please come at once. You will be in absolute control. And Colonel Orenstein came down from Johannesburg and took over supreme control of relief measures in Kimberley with this more or less blank check, open mandate. He created a comprehensive and tight-knit system which embraced all local doctors, all local pharmacists and hospitals, and rationalized their efforts. And so very unusually, he allocated particular districts to particular doctors, and the doctors had to stick to providing assistance only in those areas. Those of you who will know something about the strength of the medical profession will know that that is a very rare occasion that doctors will allow themselves to be commandeered in that way. And Orenstein said, if we're going to deal with this epidemic, you listen to these instructions. And so doctors were sent to particular districts. Bloemfontein's municipality also undertook vigorous efforts in an authoritarian way. A contemporary referred to it as a sort of ad hoc Soviet system. Never in my mind put Soviet and Bloemfontein in the same sentence, but there it is. Only the town's doctors dug in their heels and would not be commanded by anyone and held their particular practices. In the African township of Waihoek, however, they commandeered everything they could find, and if people wanted any explanation, I told them, come and see me later on, the words of the councillor who took over control of relief services in Waihoek. At no time in the history of this town has the town council been so absolute, said the town clerk. It merely had to issue requests, and vigorous workers saw to it that no one dared to refuse. As I indicated yesterday, given the immense speed of the spread of the flu, the very large number of people struck down by it, probably 50 to 60% of South Africa's population contracted the flu. It meant that probably within 3 to 4 weeks, there was no longer a sufficient minimum number of people to carry on the transmission of the flu. Too many had acquired temporary immunity. And so by the time of armistice, the 11th of November 1918, the flu had already ebbed very significantly indeed. But clearly the scars and the wounds which the flu left on individuals, on family life, were very deep indeed. Here are two contemporary accounts of the sense of relief from people who were alive at the time. A man who was 14 at the time in Cape Town. I remember at last the cloth settled on Table Mountain, and the blessed southeaster raged, carrying with it the cursed germs. No longer did people die. Few homes escaped the dreadful scourge. And as a chorister in our little Anglican church, we sang a praise of thanksgiving to mark the end of the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918. And then in Bloemfontein, a woman who was 17 at the time related to me, all I can remember of Armistice Day is that I was visiting a sick friend who was still in bed, and the fire engine, with Firemaster Savage at the wheel, went hooting and tooting around the streets in joyful proclamation. Whether there were other celebrations, I really do not know. I think Bloemfontein was still licking its wounds, so to speak. And so by November 1918, the flu was well on the wane in South Africa. It did reoccur in 1919 in a third wave, a wave which very possibly claimed the life of South Africa's first Prime Minister, Louis Botha, who died after 3 days, very telling, 3 days from flu in August 1919. That was the third wave. But having had such widespread range during the second wave, there was a relatively small number of people who were not immune in 1919, and so that third wave was not very widespread. But it very, very probably claimed the life of Louis Botha. At that point, I will stop, and tomorrow look at the consequences after I've tried to make some sense of why it was so disastrous in South Africa, the third worst hit country in the world. After Western Samoa, 23% of the population died. After India, about 7%. South Africa, about 6%. There's the question which tomorrow I will seek to address. Thank you very much. Questions other than the use of Jay's fluid? The question is virologists. That's, I think, diphtheria. Yes, that's diphtheria, particularly amongst children. Owen.
Hi, thank you. I had not figured in the second tragic identification of Rosebank Showgrounds in the demobbing on returning troops there. Two questions attached to that. Troops coming in via West Africa, South African Native Labour contingent, were they infected in France?
No, in Freetown.
In Freetown?
Freetown was an...
and the carrier there, the crewman of West Africa?
No, it was brought to Freetown by Royal Navy ship from Portsmouth. Okay. It arrived in Freetown. No restrictions, dare not interfere with military or naval operations, and so the colliers at Freetown, free access to the ship, yes. People from the ship, free access to Freetown.
Okay. And then this ludicrous safety precaution of 2 days at Rosebank Showgrounds and you're on your way. Obviously people infected, becoming ill as they disperse. Any evidence of a particular outbreak in the close-by neighbourhood of Rosebank Showgrounds?
Not in Rosebank Showgrounds, but in District 6 and amongst stevedores in the harbour. So you can almost see where the sneezes and coughs from the infected men were likely to infect. Harbour workers, and apparently the quarantine was not all that tight.
Okay. And then if I may, just another brief question. Almost the German-East Africa theatre of war, almost all of the fatalities there were from death and disease, mainly as a result of the conditions of that tropical theatre. But so many people died very late in the war. Was that as a result of flu as well?
Yes, it comes in through Mombasa.
Coming through Mombasa and demobbing through Maitland.
You can, in the same way as you can follow the railway line as the path that the vectors in South Africa, you can follow it exactly into what is now Malawi, Nyasaland, into Tanganyika as those troops were demobilized.
Okay. Because we picked up quite a large group of South African Native Labour contingent from East Africa, demobbed at Maitland and interburied at Voltemada.
Absolutely. There was a contingent here, and in fact one of the people to whom I spoke said, you know, there were Africans here, but they were not our Africans. They wore fezzes, and these were West Africans. Yeah.
One thing that worried me after I read your book was I wondered how many people had been buried alive. Because if people went round in a cart merely picking up people lying around, they could well have been unconscious, not dead at all.
Statistics I cannot give you, but there are several accounts from people to whom I spoke of exactly that happening. A number of people almost, well, the one which is in my mind is from a man who said there was a funeral procession along the main road in Mowbray of a Muslim who had died, and as they were carrying this along, they heard from inside the coffin, and they dropped the coffin and ran, and that was someone who had somehow become conscious and was desperate to escape, and did. And there are several such cases, tales. Yeah.
One that you illustrate in the book was a woman whose husband had been buried, and who later appeared in her kitchen. She promptly fell down in a faint, and they put such a thin layer of soil over the top that he'd managed to climb out of the grave.
And he owned home.
What you tell ties up with my personal history, because my grandmother died in that, she was a victim of this epidemic. And my father, when he wouldn't speak about it, but occasionally he spoke about these wagons and these bodies that were piled up and just put into mass graves.
And sort of where were they?
I think it was Coffee Fontaine.
Okay, Coffee Fontaine in the Free State.
Yeah.
Yeah. Desperate measures.
I was told that the mass graves here were on Woodstock Beach. Is that correct?
Not quite correct. One of the consequences of this is that Dr. Abdul Rahman, who was a city councillor and a very prominent member of the Muslim community, said, we actually need to put all the bodies on Woodstock Beach first to ensure that there aren't cases of burial of people who are just unconscious. And so there were bodies or coffins laid out on Woodstock Beach, but not for burial, but really just to make sure that there weren't people who really were unconscious rather than dead.
And where were the mass graves?
At Maitland. Yeah.
Where the cemetery is now?
Yeah. That dates from the 1880s, that Maitland. And there's one huge stone to commemorate flu victims there.
And just one other small statement. I believe that at the height of the flu, there were no newspapers were published, just a death list.
Not quite correct, because I've looked at all the newspapers, but what did happen is that they were very much reduced in size, so that the Die Burger turned into a 2-page, and most of the news was death notices.
In the light of people blaming Germany for being German flu, how badly was Germany affected?
The question is, how badly was Germany affected? Germany had first wave epidemic, which gave a degree of immunity to those who contracted it. So that, like most of Europe and indeed North America, it was bad, but nothing like as bad as somewhere like South Africa, which largely, except for Durban and the Witwatersrand, was exposed for the first time to second wave. So it's probably of the order of about 1% mortality in Germany. Here we're dealing with something of the order of 6%. It's about 22 million in India of reported deaths, and those statistics are by no means very, very sure. So they really, it was engulfed by the kind of tsunami, but India had first wave epidemic, so the deaths were not as numerous as in South Africa, but dealing with that size population, 22 million. Yes, but that's a very large population, some of whom had been immunized by the first, but not all.
The situation must have provoked medical people and companies to do something about this disease. Who was in the forefront to do something, to start research and development in this area? Who was it?
Can I ask you to come tomorrow, because that's what I'll be talking about? That's one way of trying to make sure that people stay the course.
Statistically, you said West Samoa was the greatest. Why?
Western Samoa was, first of all, exposed. Its first exposure was to the second wave.
Okay.
And so it was completely yesterday I spoke about this. There are two Samoas. There's Western Samoa and American Samoa. American Samoa had a very tight quarantine, not a single death. Western Samoa, under New Zealand control, open. And so it was infected. The population lived in very close proximity to one another. No prior exposure, 23.6% mortality.
And numbers?
About 8,500, but it's in a small population.
Why did the first wave not come to South Africa earlier?
Well, only that tail end. But it's true of the whole of Africa. Other than North Africa, it would seem as if that first wave did not spread from Europe to Africa other than North Africa. Well,